Thank you. Thanks, Mick, and thanks, Simon. I wasn't nervous until Simon spoke, and now I really don't know where to go. But anyway, I am going to tell you a little bit about our food systems, and we've heard a lot about that already. I'm going to tell this story in numbers, and don't worry, I'm not going all the way to 17, so I'll start with that. And look, we've heard some of this already, so I will skim over some of the early parts because I think we are here because we understand we are in a bit of a crisis. We've heard already that 1.5 degrees for our warming planet is probably not even achievable. Will we hit 2? Will we hit 3? If we hit 3, we're in catastrophic mode. But our planet is warming, it's warming fast, and it's going to have massive, massive impacts on our ability to deliver food. So that is a massive challenge for us. There are a lot of solutions, and I'm going to start a bit doomsday, and I'll hopefully come to some solutions at the end. So bear with me as we go through this bumpy journey, or this sort of melting journey. With that, we've also got this growing population. 2 billion extra mouths to feed by 2050. That's a huge number. We're going to get very close to 10 billion. And with that, it's not just growing population, it's also changing population dynamics. We've heard about urban sprawl, urbanisation, people moving to cities. People are demanding more food. With that, with 2 billion extra mouths to feed, they want 70% more food. Because our populations in emerging economies are demanding more protein, 50% more protein. That's a huge amount. But with that, how do we maintain planetary health while producing that? We don't have a second planet to be able to feed all of those people. And then, on the downside, how do we maintain biodiversity? As we move to more efficient production systems, we're actually going to less diverse diets. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And we've heard about our oceans, we've heard about natural capital. These are things that are real challenges. So 33%, 1/3 of our food that we produce is wasted. So that's a massive solution right there. If we could stop wasting that 1/3 of food that we're producing, then we've actually solved a lot of our problems already. And if we think about that is 1.3 billion tonnes of food per year. So that's a huge amount of food that would go towards feeding those populations. If just 1/4 of that could be saved, we would reduce the food gap by 12%, we'd reduce the land use gap by 27%, and we reduce our emission targets by 15%. So that goes a long way. But why have I got Vegemite up there? I mean, it's an Aussie icon. I mean, it's polarising. My son loves it. I'm not such a fan, but Vegemite's a great example of innovation. And it came at a time when supply chains were disrupted. It was right after the war, and no one could get British Marmite anymore. And so there was an Aussie innovator down in Melbourne who said, well, I'll just make our own version. That's what Aussies do. And so he made it, and it was terrible. It was awful. Couldn't eat it. So then he added some vegetable extract, and Vegemite and Marmite and all of these products are made from the spent yeast from brewing. So it's actually a story of upcycling. It's an early story of upcycling, and it's about producing something that's not only a food, but it's high nutrition. It contains all sorts of vitamins. It's really good for your immune system. You can see it's B vitamins for vitality, right? So he produced this. So that's a very early innovation that came in upcycling foods. And you can see now, they've got another example. This is actually, I'm not pitching, but it is a CSIRO spin out. Nutriv, they're taking things like the cauliflower and the broccoli and the pumpkin and things that don't make it to market. Because us consumers, we're a bit fussy. That broccoli's a bit too big. I can't put that in my crisper, or, so that's not going to make it. And so rather than turning that back into the soil, we're taking those and turning them to high protein powders that can be used in our diets, diversify our diets, increase our fibre, increase our micronutrients, and not see it go to waste. So there is technology that's coming through that can come through in these sorts of food products. But then when we think about number 4, so 1 in 4 of our greenhouse gas emissions come from our agricultural production systems. So we've got a massive challenge there as well. And when we think about agriculture production, we might think about the farm machinery and the fuel it uses, the fertilizer, the synthetic fertilizers that we're making and the energy that it takes to make those. But it's also about manure and the emissions from them, and of course methane that comes from our livestock systems. But agriculture also can be a sink for carbon. So if we do it right, we can actually sequester carbon within our soils. And we heard a little bit about nature-based solutions. So there's a whole array of things like fungi that are being utilised to capture more carbon within the soils. So there's a company called Lone Bio in Australia who are doing that. And they're using this endophytic fungi to capture more carbon and increase agricultural productivity at the same time. So while it all seems doom and gloom, there are some solutions. And then many of you will have heard about red seaweed or asparaginopsis, and it's being used as a feed supplement for cattle. So in the rumen, most people think that, you know, cows eat grass and they turn it into meat and that's great, or milk. But actually, cows eat grass, the bacteria eat the grass, and the cows eat the bacteria. And so what this does, and those bacteria are the ones that are making the methane. So what this red seaweed does is it contains a compound that inhibits those bacteria from making the methane. And so it actually reduces the methane and subsequently also increases productivity in those animals. So it's another one of the solutions. So it's not one solution, it's no silver bullet to all of these challenges. It's an array of solutions that we're looking for. Five animals and 12 plants. 75% of our calories come from that few products. Despite the fact there's 300,000 plants we could consume, it's pretty much 12. So if you go to the supermarket, if you look at the products, they'll have corn, they'll have sugar, they'll have wheat, and they might have rice. These are the crops that we rely on for our nutrition. Now there's a few challenges there. One, they're carbohydrate rich, they're protein poor, they're lacking micronutrients, so they're really not great for our diets. We have poor diversity in our diets. But not only that, we're also looking at just a handful of crops and animals. And that means that when we're looking at how resilient we are to climate change, how resilient our agricultural systems are to diseases, biotic stresses, pests, then we actually don't have that. So if we go back to the 1840s and the Irish potato famine, that was when potato blight pretty much wiped out the potato crops because Ireland was very reliant on potatoes. 20 to 25% of the Irish died over about a 4-year period because of that. Nowadays, we have things like Panama disease, which is wiping out banana plantations from Africa to Asia. So having a reliance on just a handful of foods is a real challenge for us moving forward. So we need to open up our foods to that 300,000 crops that exist. And so then if we think about six times more legumes is what we should be eating in our diets. And you know, it's the planetary health diet that was released by Eat Lancet a few years ago that made this recommendation. It goes beyond the humble baked bean, which many of us have in our diet, into products that are made from a whole array of legumes. So legumes that fix nitrogen in the soil and become a part of the solution. That can be, if we are fussy consumers who want to have a burger, can be created into plant-based burgers and sausages and things like that, but can be used in all different forms. And you can also see in these dials that there's inequity and injustice in our food systems. If you look to some countries, we can see that we've got this overconsumption of calories, some 3,700 calories that we're eating on average per day, and massive obesity rates as a result of it, compared to some of the countries with lesser available food who really are malnourished. And so we've got this inequity that exists. And then there's water, 7 or 70%. 70% of the fresh water we use is used for agriculture. Like just thinking about this number here, 3,500 litres of water you eat per day, because that's what's used in your food system just to produce the food that you have in your diet. And of course, that will depend on how many calories you're eating as well. But it's a massive number. And we need that. Crops need water to grow and we need to harvest those crops. but how processed a food is will also dictate how much water it requires. So you can see in the graph, maybe if your eyesight's pretty good at this time of night, that things like animal products use more water than, say, our vegetables and starchy roots. But lactose and can't have your dairy milk, then you might be choosing a plant-based milk in the morning. So I'm going to say, maybe don't have your almond latte, because you can see that nuts have a really high water footprint compared to the cereal-based products. So I've chosen an oat milk to consume. I like the flavour, that's great, but also it has a much lesser water footprint, and that means that it's going to be better for the planet overall. 8 or 80s. The 80s. This is when a really interesting product, in my mind, was first delivered. You may have seen this product in supermarkets, corn. But corn is made of a mycelia or mycoprotein. So this is mushrooms, but just perhaps not as you know them. So mushrooms are the fruiting bodies that exist on the surface. That's what we generally buy in the supermarket. But it's those mycelia or root-like structures that exist under the ground. And they are actually really nutritious and high in protein. They can be cultivated in stainless steel bioreactors, and it's a type of fermentation, often called solid state fermentation. And in that bottom image, you can see that they can actually be also grown like a loaf of bread and then cut into, formed into products. And so this is an example of a company who were making a bacon of sorts using this product. So these mycelia have an umami flavour. It's similar to what you have in meat. And they're rich in the protein and they're low in saturated fats. And with that, they also have a texture that's quite similar to chicken. So they can be formed into a whole range of products. So their footprint compared to, say, a beef mince is 10 times less. So this is just one of the solutions that's coming to the fore. And this has been around actually from, as you can see, since the 80s. But there's a whole array of companies who are now starting to use this type of technology. It's really low intensity compared to some of our other systems. And then 9 or 90%. And so 90% of our cheese now is made using precision fermentation of sorts. So fermentation, we often think about maybe the beer that you had earlier, or you might think about your kimchi, your yogurts, and your other products that are made that are increasing shelf life, changing the flavour of the product, maybe making a tempeh or a tofu. But fermentation is an age-old process that we've been using. We're now using it in a different way. So we're using things like yeast that we would use in brewing, but we're now using it where we're programming in the microorganisms to make specific proteins. So Eden Brew's another startup that's come out of CSIRO, and they're designing these milk proteins but making them in yeast. So you can now start to create a milk but made without the cow. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't have cows, we shouldn't have ruminants, but we should have those that are sustainable using technologies like the red seaweed that can mitigate some of those methane emissions. But there's also other complementary proteins that we can produce in this way. So as we look to the future, what it might hold for us. So it might be your oat latte in the morning, or maybe you'll be choosing a brewed food that's coming through this type of technology. So we have massive challenges in front of us, but there's also a whole array of innovation in science that will bring new products to us to hopefully complement our diets and see greater diversity into the future.